Once upon a time, there lived a couple who lived in the middle of a very big city. Their names were Kayode and Bumi, and they got married after being in a relationship for over 6 years. Bumi was now pregnant, and Kayode loved her so much and spared no opportunity to show it. He often brought her breakfast in bed and even left her handwritten notes around the house for her to find. They were like a match made in heaven, and Bumi felt like the luckiest woman alive. Their apartment was always filled with laughter, and the couple always looked forward to their time together. Kayode adored his wife greatly. Even their fights ended with forehead kisses, as they never went to bed angry at each other. He often bragged to whoever cared to listen that his wife Bumi was the best woman any man could ever have, and all his friends envied the kind of love that they shared. One morning, whilst Bumi was preparing to go for antenatal, Kayode asked her a question that she never saw coming. "Why have you refused to go to church with me?" he asked Bumi, who shrugged and paused briefly, adjusting the strap of her handbag without meeting his gaze. "I just don't feel like it," she said casually. "Besides, you already go for both of us," she said as she smiled and grabbed her bag, ready to leave for the hospital. Kayode did not utter a word, and his wife Bumi did not read much into his question. She got to the hospital and later stopped by the mall to pick up some groceries for the house. Hours later, she arrived home pressed and met her husband who had just walked out of the restroom. Bumi had to use the restroom urgently. The baby was pressing hard on her bladder, but her husband blocked her from entering. "What's wrong, baby?" Bumi asked her husband as she tried so hard to hold in her urine. Her husband Kayode did not answer. He just stood there, staring at her with an unreadable expression. Then he said, in a voice colder than winter, "Do not ever use any toilet in this house again." Bumi blinked in confusion. "Why? What happened?" But Kayode did not answer. He simply walked into their bedroom and Bumi stood there stunned as she wondered why he would prohibit her from using the toilet in their home. Unable to hold in the urine, Bumi ignored his warning and rushed in to ease herself, believing that her husband was joking. But Kayode was far from joking. She stepped out of the toilet and noticed that her husband's attitude towards her had changed. That evening, her husband Kayode did not come to the table for dinner. He didn't respond when she asked if he was okay, and when she leaned in to kiss him goodnight, he turned his face away from her. At first, Bumi attributed his strange behavior to stress. Maybe something at work had gone wrong, she thought to herself, believing that he would snap out of it and explain to her the next morning. But Kayode did not say a word to her. He locked up all the toilets in the house, not caring that his wife Bumi was heavily pregnant. He left for work, and Bumi could not believe what was happening. She called her friend Kachi, who asked what she would have done to warrant such treatment from her husband, but Bumi had no idea what she could have done. She narrated how they barely fought in their marriage, and how all of a sudden, Kayode asked her why she never attended church. Bumi could not take her mind off that single question. She believed that her decision not to go to church was the reason behind his strange attitude. However, Bumi was not willing to change. She had promised herself never to attend church and wasn't about to break that promise now. Her best friend Kachi urged her to have a word with her husband when he returned from work. "You can't sit here in the dark without knowing what is really going on. Talk to him and we'll start from there," she said to Bumi, who decided to do as her friend had suggested. She sat there, deep in thought, when suddenly she felt a sudden urge to pee. Bumi rushed off to the restroom, forgetting that her husband had locked the doors. She stood by the door, her legs shaking, as she tried to hold it in. Before she could take a step forward, the urine trickled down her legs to the floor. Bumi stood there and watched as her urine dripped onto the towels, soaking her gown and pulling at her feet. She burst into tears, the humiliation cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt before. Her hands trembled as she tried to wipe her legs with the edge of her dress, but the tears in her eyes blurred her vision. She leaned against the wall, her back sliding slowly down until she sat on the cold floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Hours passed and Kayode finally returned from work. He opened the door and walked in, only to be hit by the sharp smell of stale urine. He found Bumi still sitting in the same spot, her eyes red and swollen, her clothes damp. "What happened?" he asked, his voice flat, as Bumi looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "You happened, Kayode. I peed on myself," she said, her voice shaking. "Right here, on this floor, because my own husband locked all the toilets in the house to punish me, not caring that I'm heavily pregnant with child." Kayode looked her in the eyes, but his face gave nothing away. "I don't know what I did to deserve this. If this is about me not going to church, just say it. Stop punishing me like a child," Bumi said as Kayode walked out on her without saying a word. That evening, Bumi did all she could to talk to her husband, but Kayode ignored her completely. He refused to open the toilets for her and continued to treat her with cold silence as though her pain meant nothing. The next morning, Bumi woke up with an urge to use the restroom again. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, staring at the locked bathroom doors. Then, slowly stood up and made her way out of the house. She knocked quietly on her neighbor's door and Tomiwa opened the door for her. Tomiwa was a kind and loving young woman who lived next to them. She was a renowned Christian who never failed to preach to those that she came across. Tomiwa was about heading to church when Bumi pleaded to use her restroom. Tomiwa could not help but agree. She ushered Bumi into her home and allowed her to use the restroom. Tomiwa held herself back from asking questions. She knew how embarrassing it was already for Bumi and tried not to add to the awkwardness. Bumi, however, felt so embarrassed. She walked out of the bathroom and apologized to Tomiwa for the inconvenience. Tomiwa, the ever-kind and gracious woman, smiled at her and assured her that it was fine. Bumi then returned to her house and began to think of what she would do when she needed to pee again. Bumi did not want to abuse the kindness that Tomiwa had already shown to her, so she cut open some plastic bottles and set it in the corner, which she planned to use whenever she needed to pee. That evening, her best friend Kachi came visiting. She was so furious to see what her friend was going through in her own house. Kachi stared at the locks on the toilet, wondering why Kayode, the same man who once knelt in the rain just to propose to Bumi, had turned into a cold, wicked man. She could barely contain her rage. "This is wickedness," she muttered, her jaw clenched. "You are carrying his child for heaven's sake." Bumi tried to calm her. "Please, Kachi, don't make things worse. I don't even know what to say to him anymore." Kachi turned sharply to her. "That's exactly the problem. You've been quiet for far too long." Without another word, Kachi picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and dialed Kayode's number. She didn't even wait for Bumi's approval. It rang once, twice, and then he picked. "Kachi," he said flatly. "Kayode," she replied, her tone sharper than a blade. "Are you okay? Like genuinely okay in the head?" There was a pause before Kayode responded. "What is this about? Don't even play dumb with me," she snapped. "You locked all the toilets in your house, while your pregnant wife, your wife Kayode, has to beg the neighbor just to pee. Are you mad?" "Kachi, I don't think it's your place to tell me how to run my home." "No, you don't think. That's the problem," Kachi fired back. "What exactly did she do? Refuse to go to church? So what? Does that make her less of a woman? Does that make her less deserving of dignity?" Kayode remained silent and she continued to rant. "I've known Bumi for over 15 years. She's one of the most peaceful and loyal people I've ever met. And to see her reduced to using plastic bottles to pass waste breaks my heart in a way that I cannot explain," she said to Kayode, who hung up the call as he fumed in anger. He returned home that evening and warned Bumi sternly never to let Kachi into their home again. Bumi was so devastated. She stayed up all night as she watched her husband sleep. He did not care that she was awake, and Bumi found it hard to believe that he was the same man that she married. Not long ago, Kayode could not eat or sleep if Bumi was ever angry at him. On one occasion, He published a full-page apology in the newspaper with images of himself on his knees. Kayode could go any length to please her. Here he was now, locking toilets, refusing to speak to her, and banning her best friend from coming to their home. Bumi did not know what to do. The next morning, before she woke up from sleep, her husband had already left for work, and as usual, the toilets remained locked. Bumi swallowed her shame and approached her neighbor's door. It was the most difficult thing to do, but Bumi had no other option but to swallow her shame. Tomiwa let her into her house to use her restroom. She could tell that all was not well with Bumi and her husband, so she waited for Bumi to be done from the restroom to approach her. After a few minutes, Bumi walked into the living room to meet Tomiwa, who urged her to sit with her briefly. "Are you okay, Bumi?" she asked as Bumi burst out in tears and began to speak. "My husband has changed," she said as she told Tomiwa all that had been happening. Tomiwa was so shocked to hear this. She advised Bumi that the best way to solve a problem was to first identify what the problem was. She held her hand gently and began to speak. "Don't assume, Bumi. You need to ask your husband directly, calmly, without tears or shouting." Bumi wiped her face and nodded slowly. "I tried. I asked him if this was about church. He didn't say a word." "Then ask again," Tomiwa said. "But this time, don't ask expecting an answer. Ask to listen. Let him speak. Even silence is an answer if you really watch closely." Bumi did not reply. She simply sat there for a while, her fingers curling and uncurling around the edges of the chair. That evening, after Kayode returned home, Bumi prepared his food and waited. He walked past her, as usual, without a word. She followed him into the bedroom and stood by the door. "I'm not here to argue," she began quietly. "I just want to understand." Kayode kept his back turned to her, removing his shirt slowly, like her words were no more than a hum in the background. "Did I wrong you in any way? Did I say something? Do something? Just help me understand, Kayode, please." Kayode ignored her and went off to bed. Bumi was so broken. She had tried everything to make him talk, but Kayode remained silent. Bumi cried herself to sleep that night. She woke up in the middle of the night to realize that Kayode was no longer in bed. She could hear his voice in the living room, so she tiptoed to the door to listen and realized that he was speaking to another woman on the phone. Kayode was cheating, and Bumi could not believe her ears. She leaned closer, her breath catching as she listened. "I miss you too," Kayode whispered in the phone. "You make me feel alive again. She's just different now. I don't know who she's become. I wish I could spend every night with you instead." Bumi felt the air leave her lungs. Her knees buckled as she leaned against the wall for support. Her hands trembled, heart pounding as her mind screamed questions she didn't have the strength to voice. She waited until Kayode ended the call, then tiptoed back to bed, biting her lip to stifle the sob that was threatening to escape. The next morning, she acted normal, too normal, but inside her, a fire had been lit. She needed to know who the other woman was, and the answer came faster than she expected. 2 days later, Bumi paid her best friend Kachi a visit. Since her husband warned her not to let Kachi into their home, Bumi decided to pay her a visit instead. She arrived at home and saw her husband's car parked in front of Kachi's house. Bumi could not believe her eyes. She called her friend repeatedly on the phone, but Kachi did not respond. Bumi felt her heart race. She quickly returned home and locked herself up in her room as tears poured down her eyes. Bumi cried till her throat burned. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound she had ever known. Her husband and her best friend, the two people she trusted the most. That night, Kayode returned, but Bumi did not have the stomach to confront him. She still could not believe what was happening and needed to hear from her friend why she did what she did. Bumi called Kachi repeatedly on the phone, but Kachi did not respond. She left her a text, and after a few hours, Kachi replied her text. A short, heartbreaking text that shattered Bumi's heart into a million pieces. "Kayode is mine now. So quit trying because he will never be yours. Love, Kachi. It was a short text that seemed longer than a Shakespearean play. Bumi stared at the message for a very long time, blinking as if her mind could somehow rewrite the words, but they stayed the same. Kayode is mine now. He will never be yours. Love, Kachi. She dropped the phone, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just betrayal, it was wickedness served cold. From the one person she had trusted with her secrets, her tears, and even her marriage. She felt the floor tilt beneath her body folding into itself as she wept, loud aching sobs that cracked open something deep inside of her. And then a knock at the door. It was soft, polite. She didn't want to answer it, but the knock came again. When she finally opened the door, Tomiwa stood there with her usual warm smile and a flask of hot pepper soup. I just wanted to check on you, she said sweetly. You looked a bit off yesterday. Bumi forced a nod, stepping aside to let her in. Tomiwa placed the flask on the table and turned, wrapping her arms around Bumi. God is with you, she whispered, even when it feels like everyone else has walked away. Bumi did not respond. She couldn't, not with that message still sitting on her phone like a knife in her chest. Tomiwa offered to pray for her, but Bumi was too broken to listen. She cried out loud, unable to gain her composure, when suddenly she felt a sharp pain in her stomach. Bumi let out a loud scream as Tomiwa stood there terrified. She rushed her to the hospital, and the doctors revealed that the baby's heartbeat was faint. They had to do an emergency surgery and needed the consent of her next of kin, which was her husband Kayode. Tomiwa panicked. Her husband will come, she stammered, dialing Kayode's number with trembling hands. It rang, once, twice, 3 times, but no answer. She tried again and again, still nothing. Please, she begged the nurses, just give him a few more minutes. He'll pick. The nurse interrupted her sharply. Madam, we don't have minutes. She's crashing. If we delay this any longer, we'll lose both mother and child. Tomiwa stared helplessly at her phone. She tried calling Kachi too, but the number was switched off. And so, with shaking hands, she signed the papers herself. They wheeled Bumi into the theater, and all Tomiwa could do was pace the corridor, praying, hoping that the surgery would be a success. An hour later, a doctor stepped out and informed her that Bumi was fine, but the baby did not make it. Tomiwa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she began to cry. The doctor revealed that Bumi suffered a placental abruption from severe stress. We did everything we could, he said as he walked off, leaving Tomiwa in tears. Bumi woke up later to hear that her baby was dead. Her husband Kayode was nowhere to be found, and Bumi felt like a shell of the woman that she once was. She lay there on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling as silent tears soaked the pillow beneath her head. But Bumi felt nothing, just an emptiness that seemed to echo louder than any words of comfort. The baby she had dreamed of, the child she had spoken to every morning and night, was gone. Her husband gone, her best friend gone. Everything that had once made her life vibrant had withered in the space of weeks. She turned slowly to the window, watching as the sun rose without her consent, the light touching her skin but failing to warm her heart. Tomiwa came in with a bag of toiletries and some warm pap. Her face marked with exhaustion and remorse. You are weak, she whispered softly, placing the bag on the bedside table. I'm so sorry, Bumi. I tried to reach Kayode, but he did not pick. Bumi did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the window as Tomiwa's words hung in the room like smoke. I signed the papers. I didn't know what else to do. I just didn't want to lose you too. Still, Bumi said nothing. Her silence was heavier than 1,000 screams. Tomiwa sat beside her, hoping for a word, but Bumi's stillness was her answer. The next morning, Bumi was discharged from the hospital. Tomiwa accompanied her home in a taxi. When they arrived, Bumi walked slowly to the door like a widow returning from her own burial. She turned the key and paused. Something felt off. She pushed the door open and her breath caught in her throat. The house was empty. Kayode's shoes were gone. His shirt, his books, his framed photo from their wedding. Gone. Everything gone. On the dining table, a single envelope sat like a curse. Her name was scribbled on the front. Bumi picked it up with trembling hands as she opened it. Inside was a note. Just 5 words. I can't do this anymore. No apology, no explanation, just abandonment. Bumi's knees buckled as she sat slowly on the floor, just sitting. Tomiwa stepped in behind her, gasping at the sight of the living room. Bumi, she whispered, but Bumi told her that she would like to be alone. Tomiwa hesitated for a moment, torn between staying and respecting Bumi's wish, but something in Bumi's tone, flat, lifeless, final, made her nod quietly as she stepped out. As the door closed behind her, Bumi remained still on the cold floor, the note clenched in her hand, her wedding ring heavy on her finger like a shackle. All the sounds in the world faded, the ticking clock, the distant cars, even her own breathing. Everything slowed into silence. She looked around at the empty house. The walls still held echoes of laughter. The corners remembered joy, but now it all felt like a stage after the curtain had fallen. Everyone was gone. The play was over. Her eyes drifted to the corner where the plastic bottle still sat, the one she had used when no toilet was available. A painful reminder that even in her own home, she had been stripped of dignity. Bumi stood up slowly, her limbs weak, but her resolve awakening like a whisper in her bones. She walked to the bathroom door, picked up a hammer and smashed the locks open. As she stepped into the toilet for the first time in months, Bumi felt a strong urge to pray. She had not prayed in years, since her mother died in her hands, despite all the prayers she made to God to save her life. Bumi prayed day and night, and even fasted for weeks, but yet her mother still died. She sat on the cold toilet floor, her hands trembling as her breath became shallow. Bumi, for the first time in years, whispered her first real prayer. God, I don't even know if you're listening. I prayed when my mother was dying, and still she died. I gave you everything I had then, and you were silent. She wept as she spoke. But this pain is deeper than anything I've known. I've lost my baby. I've lost my husband, my friend, my peace. I don't even know who I am anymore. Her voice cracked into sobs, her forehead resting on the edge of the bathtub, and there, with nothing but the towels around her, Bumi poured her heart out like a broken jar of oil, shattered but still fragrant. She prayed until her voice was gone. Then she cried herself to sleep on the toilet floor and found herself in a dream. She was underwater, but she could still breathe. The sea was deep and still as she looked around terrified. Then she saw him, her husband Kayode. He was chained to a black stone at the bottom of the ocean, his hands bound behind him as his face was pale. He was not dead, but he was no longer himself. His eyes turned towards her slowly, as though he barely remembered who she was. Beside him floated a woman, not just any woman, a creature with long flowing hair and a fishtail that shimmered like oil in water. It was Tomiwa, her neighbor, but not the sweet neighbor that she had grown to like. This version had sharp nails, blue-black scales on her arms, and a wicked smile that twisted like smoke. You shouldn't have laughed at me, Bumi. The creature hissed, her voice echoing like a drum in the deep. Bumi's heart froze. She remembered it now. Months ago, when Tomiwa had just moved into the compound and introduced herself warmly, Bumi had rolled her eyes behind her back. That same evening, she had called Kachi and laughed over the phone, saying, "This new neighbor is too eager. All these friendly ones are usually the ones that end up snatching husbands." She never knew Tomiwa heard her, and Tomiwa was not who she seemed. The mermaid swam closer to Kayode and caressed his face. "He belongs to me now. You pushed me away. You insulted me. So I came for everything that you have." Bumi tried to scream, to swim, to fight, but her limbs were stiff. She could only watch in horror as Kayode bowed his head beside the sea witch like a slave. Then the mermaid turned her eyes to Bumi. "Stay broken, Bumi," she whispered. "That's all you ever be." Bumi gasped and jolted awake, sweat pouring down her face, her heart slamming against her ribs. She sat up breathless, back in the unlocked toilet. It was a dream, but she knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a revelation. Tomiwa was never her friend. She was the enemy in disguise, the serpent that slithered through her shame and softened her spirit to finish what she started. Bumi stood slowly, staring into the mirror above the sink. She remembered the olive oil that her mother had given to her years ago when she was still alive. Bumi rushed to her room to get it. She anointed the toilet and began to pray when suddenly she heard a knock on her door. A loud, persistent knock, followed by a voice that warned her to stop what she was doing. Bumi knew better than to stop. She continued praying as she anointed herself and her entire house. She got to the door and anointed it too, ignoring her evil neighbor who stood outside. The banging stopped and Bumi heard a loud cry outside the door. Tomiwa began to confess all that she did. What had happened was that months ago, when Tomiwa moved into their compound and tried to make friends with Bumi, Bumi was not receptive. Rather, she went on to discuss with her best friend Kachi, laughing and saying that she was not looking for friends who would end up stealing her husband. Tomiwa overheard the whole conversation from her house. She was so livid and decided to ruin their marriage. Tomiwa, being a mermaid, needed a way to get through to Kayode, so she began to attend his church, pretending to be a holy sister. One day, after church service, she approached him and asked why his wife never came to church, and Kayode just smiled at her. She then seized the opportunity to put doubt in his mind about his wife. "She is possessed by water spirits," she said to him as she told him to watch out and notice that his wife always goes into the toilet right after he uses it. "She is doing something evil to you," she said to Kayode as she walked out on him, leaving him with the strange thoughts that she had planted in his mind. Kayode returned home and noticed that truly his wife always went into the toilet right after he finished using it. That was why Kayode locked the toilet and prevented his wife from ever using it. What he did not know was that Tomiwa overheard his wife's conversation on the phone with her friend, complaining that her pregnancy had made her so irritated with the fact that her husband Kayode always left the toilet in a mess whenever he used it. So in a bid to manage this, she had to go into the toilet immediately he finished using it to clean up the mess. Tomiwa used this revelation to gain complete access to Kayode, ensuring that only Kayode used the toilet in his home. Being a mermaid, she used the water in the water system to gain access to Kayode, who she put under her complete control. She orchestrated everything that happened to break them apart. On the day that Bumi found her husband's car in front of her best friend's house, Tomiwa was the one who sent Kayode to go warn Kachi to stay away from his wife, stating that she was evil. Tomiwa then appeared to Kachi in her home that night, using her friend Bumi's face in her mermaid body. Kachi was so terrified, she ran out of her house, leaving her phone behind, and Tomiwa used the opportunity to take the phone. Tomiwa then used Kachi's phone to send a text to Bumi, claiming that Kayode was now hers. All the while that Kayode left their home, he was in her neighbor's house, acting as her slave, doing whatever that she so wanted. Even the pregnancy that Bumi lost was all Tomiwa's doing, as she confessed it all to Bumi, who stood there, frozen in her doorway. Tomiwa's voice was now trembling, her cries echoing down the corridor like a mad woman. Bumi held the door frame tightly to keep herself from collapsing. Her knees trembled under the weight of the truth. The woman who held her hand in prayer, who gave her soup and pap, who smiled and let her use her bathroom, had been the very one orchestrating her pain all along. Tomiwa dropped to her knees just outside the door, scratching her face with her own nails. "They told me not to touch a woman with purpose, but I didn't listen. I wanted you to feel small. I wanted you to suffer for mocking me. I wanted to take everything from you, and I did." Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered as Tomiwa screamed out loud, grabbing her head from the corner of the corridor. Water began to seep through the walls and floor tiles, swelling and glowing. Bumi backed away as the powerful gust of air surged into her apartment, lifting papers and curtains like they were weightless. "They are coming for me!" Tomiwa screamed as the water enveloped her and disappeared. Just like that, the hallway went silent. Bumi opened her door and looked around. The door to Tomiwa's house gently opened, and her husband walked out of her house looking so confused. He stumbled forward like a man who had just woken up from a long deep sleep. His eyes were sunken as he looked around the corridor as if seeing it for the very first time. "Bumi," he called out, looking so confused. "What's going on? Why am I here?" he asked as Bumi walked into their house without saying a word. Kayode followed her in and noticed that her belly was now flat. "The baby?" he asked as Bumi burst out in tears. It was a painful time for Bumi and Kayode, who could not believe how they allowed another woman to ruin the beautiful life that they had built. Bumi began to attend church with her husband as they sought out counseling to help with their marriage. Bumi also paid Kachi a visit one evening, knowing that Kachi was also a victim of Tomiwa's evil plan. They reconciled despite learning their lessons in the most difficult way, and so life began again for the once happy couple who gently found their way back to each other. The lesson to be learned from this story is that we should be careful of the utterances that we make. A careless word can do more harm in a man's life than the sharpest knife. Bumi's story teaches us that evil often wears the face of kindness, and betrayal can come clothed in prayers and smiles. It reminds us never to mock or belittle others, for we do not know the strength of their bitterness or the lengths they are willing to go. But above all, this story is a reminder that spiritual sensitivity and prayer are not optional in life. They are necessary shields. In a world where unseen forces manipulate the hearts of men, staying prayerful, discerning, and gracious may be the only way to keep our homes and destinies protected. I hope you enjoyed the story.